Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Gathering Eagles stage Colonel John Warden.
Y'all, thank y'all. Pleasure, thank you.
Colonel Warden, it's a pleasure to be out here with you, sir. And we talked about a number of things through the course of working on the book and the interview, but today I'd like to highlight for the crowd here today some of your early deployments and the impact those, and the way they shaped those experiences shaped your views on air power and planning from a strategic and operational level.
Okay, yeah, great. I would expand that just a little bit in terms of, as you sort of start out, there are three things that are going on that you're doing, I believe. One is that you are improving your ability to execute the tactical, the mechanical part of the thing, learning to fly better, et cetera. Second part is learning how to improve your command skills, and a big chunk of that is simply observing the things that people above you are doing well and are doing poorly, the things you're going to emulate, the things you're never going to do that kind of a thing. And then the third thing, I think, is which becomes exactly relevant to your question, is the observing and learning things that allow you to do things beyond just the flying, the squadron, the wing kinds of things. So if I'm thinking about the things that I found to be particularly useful and interesting from that standpoint, one of the first ones really was in the fourth wing from Seymour Johnson, when with a week's notice, we had airplanes, a whole wing that was augmented to about 100 F-4s, had flown from Seymour Johnson to Kunsan Air Base in Korea after the seizure of the Pueblo. That made a huge impression from two directions, and the most important one was the demonstrated ability of the United States Air Force to move an extraordinary amount of combat power in an extraordinarily short period of time. It was done flawlessly. It was beautifully done. And I'm sitting in the airplane and really quite impressed with it. The other side of it, though, was when we got to Kunsan, there were no plans to do anything with at that time the 100 top newest F-4s in the United States inventory. So the airplanes were literally parked wingtip to wingtip at Kunsan, made probably a pretty decent target if anybody had been interested, and nor was there any plan for how the airplanes were going to be employed in any kind of combat thing. So I was a little bit surprised, because my impression had always been, well, the higher headquarters, whether that was wing or numbered Air Force or whatever it was, they knew how to do these things, and thought, well, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So that was pretty interesting. The deployment, not so much from a movement standpoint, but the next thing that I think was pretty useful was, as for many of us, was the experience in Vietnam. And my observation on Vietnam, so looking around, was that everybody looked like they were doing their jobs very, very well, whether they were flying, whether they were shooting, whether they were sailing. And we were winning battles. We were beating the devil out of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regular forces. So we're doing everything exactly right, and we lost the war. So something was amiss with that. Next thing that was pretty interesting was at Torrejon, flying F-4s again. So exposure now to a long-standing peacetime command, USAF, but more importantly, from my standpoint, was I had the opportunity to participate in the development of the first deployment of U.S. Air Force airplanes to Persia, to Iran, to Tehran, that had been done roughly since World War II. So that gave me an opportunity to see a piece of the country, a piece of the world that I hadn't seen before, and also gave me pretty good insight into the different ways of thinking that you could see between the Americans, the British, the Turks, the Persians, the Iranians, and it helped an awful lot, because I further started thinking about this whole business of of what can be done in the Middle East. Again, not quite from a deployment standpoint, but would like to mention, I think, in this context a little bit about experience in the air staff after it came back from Spain and completed a year doing a master's degree at Texas Tech. And that experience was, I was a desk officer for all of the Middle East Africa countries, every one of them, as I recall. So I got a chance to really sort of understand how each one of them worked at a little bit deeper level. And then also got involved for the first time in really looking at high-level plans, the operations plans, the con plans that were the secure plans, and so on. And one of the things that began to be clear, in my mind at any rate, was that we were focusing an enormous amount of our resources, virtually all of them, to protect against a Soviet onslaught across the Fulda Gap. Well, that was fine unless the Soviets decided to go someplace else, and it struck me that they could easily decide that they were going to go around the other side, basically to come down through Iran, conceivably Iraq, warm water ports, seizure of the oil, and a variety of other things like that. That seemed to make a good deal of sense. And as we started thinking about that, then you realized that the command arrangements that existed at the time with SINCUR having responsibility for that area simply could not work, or were highly unlikely to work, because SINCUR was so focused on that Fulda Gap area, that Central European area, that for them to think in terms of dedicating resources and other things to something that was 2,000, 2,500 miles away was simply unlikely. So then that led to the thought that, well, maybe the solution is a change in command ideas, and with the proposal to make Readiness Command, give that responsibility for that area to Readiness Command, which happened, that was called US REDCOM at the time, if I recall, and then that morphed within the next couple of 3 years into Central Command, and therefore the structure was there that General Schwarzkopf and General Horner could exploit so beautifully when the actual war opportunity came up a few years later. So that worked out quite interestingly. Then other things with doing deployments of F-15s and F-4s, learning about the mobility, how to move things, and then thinking about large formations for air-to-air particularly, and then also for air-to-ground, squadron and larger size, and having opportunity to practice that at Incirlik, where you could actually see the impact of having a lot of airplanes coming at any sort of area of the enemy lines, if you will. So those things then were pretty useful in thinking about kind of the next iteration. So that's an answer at any rate.
Yes, sir. So talking about those problems with planning that you recognized early on, we'd like to fast forward to your time as the Deputy Director for Strategy, Doctrine, and Warfighting. Could you tell us, so you talked about the state of planning earlier, could you tell us about the state of planning when you arrived there in that job, and how you and your team decided to approach this?
So there were a couple of issues, and this is now, we're in 1988, and at the planning that existed at the time was superb at a squadron level, at a wing level, with the red flags and all the rest of it. That was absolutely great. But then if you move to the very highest level, that what you found was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Defense Guidance, and the other things of this sort, that air power was not being thought of in the way that it ought to be thought of for modern war, that it was seen as something that was strictly a support to the Army, so that the two options for Europe really were a major deployment of 10 divisions, 10 days kind of a thing, which was probably a bit on the optimistic side, I'm guessing. And oh, by the way, some airplanes are going along and there are already some there, or if that doesn't work, then there's a naval option. So the question then becomes, okay, so there's sort of a ground option, there's a naval option, why isn't there an air option? If you want to get power to Europe fast, you get it there with airplanes. So why don't we think about how we could deal with the Soviets significantly through air, not completely, not to win the war at that particular point, but for that to be the thing that you would put the emphasis on for your deployments and so on and so forth. So we spent a lot of time trying to convince the Office of the Secretary of Defense that we ought to be changing the planning guidance, and had some reasonable success with that up until the time that we got closer to the time of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So I think that should roughly cover that, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, kind of expanding upon that a little bit, as you're moving into those events, it's clear that we do a lot of planning in a hurry to get ready for that kind of unexpected event. Can you give us a little sense of what your team there did, and how you became involved in the process, and how you got things done in such a short amount of time?
Well, there were a couple factors that were involved in it. That at the time that I had 5 air staff divisions, including Checkmate, and that out of that, with those 5 divisions, almost 100 officers, all really smart people that were pretty good thinking, and we had spent a good deal of time thinking about what can you do with air power at a very high level. And one of the things that flowed out of that particular set of thinking was the concept of the 5 rings, which was really developed initially to show what you could really do with air power and how to think about air power in terms of the impact that it could have on an opponent, on an enemy. Well, we found fairly quickly that, yes, it did that fairly well, but it also could make a pretty powerful way to actually to do targeting. It would give you a methodical way to think through the problems, what are you trying to accomplish, et cetera. And one of the things that we did in roughly the year prior to the advent of the Iraqi invasion was to do an exercise using the 5 rings and applying it to Soviet ground forces making an attack into Europe. We presented the conclusions, that study, in a briefing to the then the U.S. Army in Europe Commander General St. John, and he said, wow, this is a great way to think about this. This is a great way to use air power. How about going and putting this against the big stockpiles of weapons that the Soviets had buried in a variety of places? So I said, fine, we'd be happy to do that. But then it wasn't too long after that that the Iraqi invasion came along, so the Soviets were no longer of any interest in, and when the war was over, nobody had the slightest interest in planning anything for the Soviets because they were all gone. So that was we had an opportunity to think about what you can do. So along comes the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So we've thought about this and thought, well, so we don't know specifically what plans might be going on at CENTCOM, CENTAF, wherever, but we've got some pretty good ideas. So pulled together just a handful of people and said, let's put something together and to do the best, to put together the best sort of a plan that we can to use air power and to really use it to win. And it said to the group, I have no idea how we're going to sell this or even whether we can, but let's build it and then we'll see what happens from there, which we did. And then we had a bit of an unusual break, if you will, certainly from our standpoint, and that was a couple of days after we'd started that process that General Schwarzkopf had called up the air staff, talked to General Lowe. General Lowe said, hey, got some guys that are doing this sort of a thing, and they'll be happy to show you what they're doing. So we did a couple of days later, and we're doing this all out of Checkmate, which is now expanded into people coming from all over the air staff and from SAC headquarters, and some from TAC headquarters, not a lot, and then from a variety of other places in the government, the intelligence services, and so on. So we put this together with these 300 people in a couple of days, took it down to General Schwarzkopf. General Schwarzkopf said, this is good, develop a little bit more. A week later, back giving it to General Schwarzkopf. He said, this is great, this is what we're going to do. Talk to General Powell, et cetera. And then he asked me to take it over to give it to General Horner, which we then did a couple of days later, and left some guys there Dave Deptula and Ben Harvey and Stanfill, and they then, I think, served as the core for things that were going on in Riyadh. In the meantime, we're back in Washington and finding that this open planning that we have done with Checkmate, in which that we've had people coming in from all the intelligence agencies and getting lots and lots of flows of information coming in, provided us the opportunity to send an enormous amount of information and do an enormous amount of analysis that we then sent over to General Glosson, Colonel Deptula, Lieutenant Colonel at the time, for them to look at, use in any way that they might choose to do it. There was no identification stuff on it. And having that connection turned out to be I think, of more than a little bit of value. The other thing that was really fascinating about it was, and it's difficult for the majority of you probably to envision this, but in fact that you think that all of the decisions that are made in Washington are made on the basis of cold rationality and objectivity and so on and so forth. Not the case, simply not the case. And I would have to say that there was huge opposition to the whole concept of an air campaign, of the things that were done and were being created into what would eventually become Desert Storm. Huge opposition from significantly from the Army, some from the very most senior Army officer who was in Washington at the time, in as high a place as you could find, some people in the White House itself, and scattered all over the rest of the place. And you can't imagine the kinds of attacks that are always going on. Saying, this is never going to work, this is wrong, we can't do this is not fair, all kinds of stuff. So just having that ability to have people in Washington that had a pretty good understanding of what the concepts were, to go out and deal with it, I think was, I believe, was essential. It's one of those things that I think was very difficult to have done, maybe impossible, to do it from Riyadh, because you get very far away from a power center, and all of a sudden the power center is doing what it wants to do and sort of nuts to what it is that you want to do. So that was all really, I think, enabled by this whole concept of open planning. And the open planning, very simply, was let's not decide who is authorized to see it, but let's get people in that are going to have ideas. And boy, the ideas that came in from outside that we hadn't thought about, and that in several cases turned out to be of significance, we never would have gotten them in the absence of the open planning, nor would we either have had all of that automatic inflow of intelligence, current information. I mean, we literally had people, by the time the war started, we had people who were in the KH-11 download stations, and they would pick up the phone if they say, hey, we see something like a railroad train that's unloading, just to take a trivial example. They would call instantly, and we say, okay, interesting, important stuff, and we pick up the phone and call over, talk to Dave or to Glosson or whomever. And then again, they can confirm that information and do whatever they wanted with it. But it provided a way to move information and intelligence which was significantly developed or processed or only available in Washington, to move it to the place where it was going to be used. And this is the open planning, and I not only became a huge believer in it during that experience, but then subsequently in my business life, have introduced it into the business world. We found it's equally valuable and important.
Sir, in the time leading up to the Gulf War, your team recognized that we as the Air Force were stuck in the Cold War mindset, and your team was able to, in part, help move us out of that mindset, to the credit of the enormous success of the Gulf War air campaign. What we'd like to hear about are, what are your thoughts about the Air Force now and our mindset now? Do you think we're stuck in a mindset and need to evolve from where we are?
Yes. Next question. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can expand a little bit if you like me to.
I'd appreciate that.
So you all may remember that the Secretary of Defense Bob Gates gave the talk in Colorado Springs about 10 years ago, ballpark. It may have been plus or minus a year or two. And I'm paraphrasing, but I think reasonably accurately. What he said was, I want to do away with this whole business of futurism. I don't want anybody thinking about future wars. I want you to concentrate on today's war. Well, so the Secretary of Defense says that. He remains in power for, another 4 or 5 years, and that becomes a big part of service life, Defense Department, the country, and all the rest of it. Well, that the focus on the war, I mean, one can sort of understand that, but we think about the war that he was having us focused on. It was you'd really have to say that the wars of, at least since the invasion of Baghdad in 2003 for the Second Gulf War, have really been very tactical operations where there's some little group over here and you do something with them and then something with this one and 1 or 2 airplanes or 3 or 4 or whatever, and it's a primitive thing. There's no air defense. There's nothing else. So if you specialize for that kind of war, what you are doing is that you are virtually putting yourself out of business to fight a serious war against a serious enemy that presents a genuine strategic threat. So I think in some ways that maybe we are in a worse situation today from that standpoint than we were at the end of the 1980s, because at the end of the 1980s we had people, some of the planning, the thinking may not have been as smart as it could be, but boy, the development of the technology and so on, it wasn't based on fighting the original Korean War again. It was based on fighting something really important, and thus the 117s and all the rest of this grand stuff. We know what the results have been of some people that have really pushed the high-tech things like the F-22s and so on and so forth. We have that element of it. Second element was I think, sort of the underlying contest. When we were coming towards when we were still deep in the Cold War, that you had a Soviet Union with a military capability. It was kind of slowly moving, and it was kind of cumbersome, but nevertheless, it was pretty significant. And the underlying philosophy was communism. Well, we knew that communism was bad, and sort of everybody in the West said, we don't like communism, we like some form of capitalism or freedom, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting that although people will die for communism, it's not quite as deep a faith as there might be from something else. So you could deal with that, and it was reasonably easy. Now we're into a situation where that we are facing an opponent who deeply, deeply, deeply believes in everything they do. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. They genuinely believe. And I guess you almost throw this out as a question. So ask yourself, what do you all believe in? What does the West believe in now? What is the West, and what is its raison d'etre? Why is it that it should be willing to fight for in all of these far-off places and so on and so forth? That's a question that must be addressed, and it must be answered. So I think if even given that, in the shorter term at any rate, that we can afford to make a lot of mistakes in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. It's not going to be strategically destructive on any short-term basis. But that's not going to last forever. At some point, 5 years, 6 years downstream, whatever it is, there's going to be a genuine strategic threat by somebody that's extraordinarily competent and maybe actually has better stuff than what we have. And if we haven't prepared ourselves adequately to deal with that kind of threat, then we're facing civilization destruction. We are facing destruction of the country, and we don't need to do that. So we simply have got to be thinking about what is it that we really want to do. And my simple idea on the thing is that from a military technological standpoint, we really ought to be at least a revolution ahead of everybody else in the world. Whoever's number 2, that they are 1/10 of wherever we are from a technology standpoint. Doesn't mean we need to have 10 times as many airplanes. We need to have 10 times as much technological capability. And that, I think, is doable if there is a decision to do it, and that there's a commitment by the senior Air Force, senior DOD, and the White House. The White House has got to make that commitment also.
Sure, was a great answer, and it kind of makes me think of the other side of that equation. One of your discussions we had was about an experience you had over in Russia and the chance that you got after the fall of the Soviet Union to go over there and see kind of their planning. I'm curious to maybe share that experience with the folks here and hear what your thoughts are on today's version of that. What your thought of a peek behind the curtain today would reveal as we move across there.
Actually, when I was here as the Commandant of Command Staff College, General Quast, one of your predecessors, General Kelly, was invited to go to then by now Russia on a tour of their professional military education. Part of that tour was to go down into the General Staff headquarters in Moscow, which was absolutely fascinating. It was a building that was maybe 6 or 7 stories tall, but that wasn't what was really there. What was really there was 6 or 7 stories that went down. So we went down and down and down. I have no idea how many levels we went down. And finally, we came out into this large briefing room. It was probably almost like the middle, the last third of this auditorium in size. And in it, that they had some bleacher kinds of chairs around in a place for somebody to do briefing. And then probably 100 foot long was a topographical map that stretched from the Ural